to do with the informal city, with a new wave of urbanization around the world, which by far is mainly informal and supposedly unplanned, but of course it's planned. And this is the work of Norit Alfasi, my colleague from Beersheba, is important here, when she talks about self-organizing communities. And quite often in Israel, Palestine, in Iran, in Cairo, in Lagos, in Cape Town, most of the cities now are self-constructed. So we can debate the planned city, but we debate a minority of the city, or maybe sometimes only part of the city. But race spacing is incredibly important, both as a territory, but also as bodies. People that infiltrate into cities, unregistered, illegal, temporary, quite often. So the whole idea of race spacing and exclusion and inclusion is something that we have to deal with much more. So we spatialize the discussion on justice, and we are not, of course, the only one. There's a lot of people that, or well, there's some very good contribution in recent times. In the last decade, there's a spate of books about the justice and the city. This is Brenner, Marcuse, and Margit Meir. Don Mitchell wrote about the right to the city, very good book. Social justice and the life for public space. Harvey's book from a couple of years ago, Rebel Cities, is very interesting in that respect, and actually talks about these Occupy movements. Ed Soldier, before he died, seeking spatial justice. This we've seen already, some in Hebrew. Actually, I did a special issue, if any of you read Hebrew, special issue of the Israeli Planning Journal on the Just City. And it's called The City Demands Social Justice. And then we come to Susan Feinstein, a book from about 2012, I think, that tries to sort of weave these strands together. And I think a very notable contribution, something that perhaps intellectually or theoretically is not breaking new grounds, but its power is a thing that it gives us tool with which we can work, we can actually translate into policies. And she has a Rawlsian approach, but she breaks it down into three elements of the Just City into which planning should work as a horizon: equity, diversity, and democracy. And with equity, she takes from Rawls the whole idea of fairness, the veil of ignorance, and the whole elaboration all the time of what would be fair in terms of decisions and allocations of power and resources. Diversity, which she relies on Saint-Lecoq to some extent, and on Young, but she waters it down. She waters it down to diversity, which is softer than identity, right? Diversity is a liberal concept of diverse kind of complexions. But anyhow, it's important because she enters it into planning theory, and democracy, which we decided, it's a very important form of political justice. So, as I said, I didn't translate all these, sorry Barbara, some of this in Hebrew, but her main criticism in the book, if you read the first couple of chapters, and she goes through Lefebvre and Young and Nussbaum and Sen and the great philosophers, she said they all remain abstract. They all remain abstract, and they're very good for university seminars, but they're not of much use to policymakers. And her book is trying to make it useful for policymakers. She said, let's develop tools that actually can be translated. So all this blurb in Hebrew, that's what it says. Last theoretical point I want to add is the dark side of planning. And that takes me back to my own work 25 years ago. My God. Anyhow, at the time, I was living in Australia, and I was struck by the distorted self-perception of planners, geographers, and architects. That all they write about the work is positive. they try to make the world better. Sometimes they fail. It's not their fault. If you are a libertarian, it's the fault of the state. If you are liberal, it's the fault of wrong regulation or too much regulation. If you're a socialist, it's the fault of capitalism. If you're a woman, it's the fault of men. But they try to do something good all the time. And it was like, I wrote about it with Margot Huxley, total blind spot about half the world. And half the world uses power and policy to oppress, to marginalize, to weaken. This is not such an invention, you know. This is what power politics is about, is to make someone stronger, at the same time someone weaker, to give to someone and to deny from someone else. So we started to look at planning. We saw no literature about planning as control, planning as oppression. And we started to write. Margot brought her Foucauldian perspective. I brought my colonial aspect into it. And we started to write about what anybody can see. If you just open your eyes to see planning that is used as oppression. And also Ben Flyberg did very good work on Denmark a couple of years later. So with the very same tools, infrastructure, housing, land, planning process, you can actually achieve improvement, a more just city, or a more unjust city with the same tools. And this is any philosophical or epistemological idea about it will immediately say, you know, that I can, with my lecture, I can enrich you and educate you, and I can do the opposite. I can tell you lies, right? With the same kind of. So every, if we have a critical analysis of every aspect of social, every type of social power, and of course Foucault is so strong in that, we can see how planning is used to contain, marginalize, oppress, usually it's minorities, or women, or immigrants, or sometimes people that are rivals. And we looked at three main logics of oppressions through planning. The logic of capital, which is accumulation and therefore deprivation, because it's privatized, so accumulation of some is deprivation of others, and exploitation. The logic of governance, which is legal, the power of the state or institution speaks the law, speaks the plan, and therefore it marginalizes and excludes others that are not in that. And the logic of identity, which is about territory, gerrymandering, we call it hostile recognition, right? The liberals of the planet talk about recognition. Sandekop, in her book, she talks about recognition. We must recognize this group and that group and that group, and it's absolutely right. But what about the groups you recognize as enemies? What about the groups that planning recognizes people that should be contained, oppressed, and deport, like the people of southern Tel Aviv now, right? They are there for deportation. They hide now, and people chase them and hunt them to deport them. That's part of the planning of Tel Aviv now. So this is what we enter the debate in terms of the dark side of planning. Again, we did a few charts about the continuum between justice and oppression. Of course, there are many ways. It's not a binary kind of thing. It can change over time. But definitely there is a range of policies that we should consider all the time. With particular groups maybe enjoying the planning system, other groups are being suffer from the planning system, and we should treat that as part of our justice work. Not just what we can do and how we can improve, but who is oppressed, who is silenced, who is marginalized, and how in our justice work we can actually treat them differently. And I think the way forward is to combine the positive and the critical perspective, the way forward in terms of practice. So you need the critical element, but you also need the positive element to actually translate it into a better city. Maybe Barbara, you would be interested that I came up with this idea a long time ago, urban social sustainability, which is the precursor to resilience. Did a couple of articles. Where is this? This is an article from the 90s. You see how the top of the picture goes in there, and then the rest in here? So when I worked in Australia, I did a series of articles about social sustainability, urban social sustainability, and this was before the Just City idea, but nonetheless it was an important foundation. And then, now in Israel, we started to think about a particular tool that would take on board these ideas, both the oppression that has to be prevented or turned around, and the positive elements that should be strengthened. And it's mainly, social impact assessment is mainly used in education, in social work, and we wanted to develop it as a planning tool. And this would, perhaps rather than go through all the different part of it, we just maybe go to the example of Beersheba, what we did. So we decided in this workshop about 4 years ago, let's take these theories, let's look at what we can actually develop as a tool. And there are several things, of course, you can develop, but social impact assessment seems to be something very missing. That is, you have plan after plan for a city or for a region, and if this plan fails, what do the planners and architects normally do? They just do another plan. They don't analyze it, and also they don't analyze the possible impact of the plan on social relations. They might look at it sometimes on the number of housing units, maybe on the open space. Sometimes they might look at it as the impact on economic development. But very rarely they have a tool how to look at the plan. When they devise the plan, what is the likely social impact? And that's what we decided to do. SIA, we call it in English, but in Hebrew and Arabic, they're better acronyms. But SIA is also quite nice. You know the singer Sia, the one that covers her face? Do you know her? The singer is a very talented musician. So what we thought, this kind of tool should be used whenever a major plan comes to a city. Whenever there is city council, metropolitan council discussing a major plan, it should have compulsory social impact assessment. To some extent echoing the environmental input that from the 1990s in most countries you have environmental impact assessment that measures and assesses what can happen to the environment with those kind of interventions. So then there's the Beersheba case study. We actually, two plans to Beersheba were assessed. The main one that we did 2 years ago is the new outline plan for Beersheba, which is still not approved. And I think to some extent thanks to our intervention, because in the year 2015 we did this project a whole year, and then we did a lot of publicity, what the plan that was already on the table is likely to do. And since then the Beersheba Council, not only because of us but also other groups, is trying to amend it, but it hasn't been approved yet. Although they're starting to build according to this plan, this is still not... And also, a few years before, we assessed the Metropolitan Plan, which, as you see, that it's a different plan. Metropolitan Plan is much more the region of Beersheba, and the outline plan for Beersheba is just a city. But these two documents, of course, overlap in a great way. So, just to show, this is the article that I did with Rani Mandelbaum, just published a few months ago, 2 or 3 months ago. And it's called Doing the Just City, Social Impact Assessment, and the Planning of Beersheba. And this is some of the reports we did to the media and to the council. This says the city demands social justice. And we did in a couple of conferences. This is the earliest article we did about the Metropolitan Plan, Urban Justice Recognition, Affirmation, and Hostility in Beersheba. So the two will be combined. What, half an hour more? Barbara, do I have half an hour more?
Yes, please.
Okay. And these are the students at the time, in 2015, working, master students. There was a group of about 15 and did really great work. And just for some geography, this is, anybody's been to Israel, Palestine? Just one? Here is Jerusalem. This is the West Bank. This is Tel Aviv, the largest city, about 3 million. And here is Beersheba. The region here is about 600,000. The Beersheba itself is about 230, 240,000. And in this is geopolitical map. You can see the white spaces are Jewish spaces, the green spaces are Palestinians of different types, with Israeli citizenship, without Israeli citizenship. And of course it's part of one of the most protracted ethnic conflicts in the world for the last 100 years. And the centerpiece of this conflict is land. So planning is so critical because planning controls land use. And very much in the last decade and a half, the conflict is in the Negev about land and planning. The whole state of Israel, of course, is an immigrant society as well. It's immigrant settler society. It's the number 2 state in the world in terms of immigrants. Which is number 1? Let's say it's about everybody thinks United States, but it's about number 10, United States. Australia is about 30% of Australians not born in Australia. And sociologists treat immigration as a 2-generation process. If you are a child of immigrants, also you're considered part of the immigration process. So more than half of Australians are. And in Israel, I think it's 28%. It's also very high. So also more than half Israelis are immigrants. And Canada is very high, but interesting, sorry?
Canada
is the 3rd highest, I think. But interestingly, now European countries, never they're ranked the top 10. Now Sweden, Germany, Britain are all there in terms of more than 20% of population not being born in the country. United States, I think, is just 11% not being born in the country. But of course, historically, United States is the prototype immigrant society, but not in recent years where they actually clamped down on numbers of immigrants. I can show you all this, but it's very important for Israel because planning and identity is very much related to immigration. And immigration enters considerations about space, about culture, very much multicultural society. Multicultural and binational, all in the same small space. Barbara was there. You could see it on the landscape, how multicultural and how contested it is.
I remember the issue about the pine trees.
About?
The pine trees.
Pine trees, yeah. Pine trees and they plant over contested lands, yeah. And anyway, so we shall continue. Just some statistics. It's also quite important. Beersheba is an ex-Arab city. Until 1948 it was an Arab city. It was resettled mainly by Mizrahim. This is Jews that come from the Middle East. This is also a big issue in Israel between the Jews, the Western Jews and the Eastern Jews. They're not the same group. There are a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. And then later on by Russian Jews. At the same time, Beersheba is an indigenous region of the Bedouins for centuries and centuries. Some people say maybe 1,000 years. But the state is trying to forcefully urbanize the Bedouins. And they resist it. This is one of the examples of grey spacing, the sort of informal. And the state declared, this is my recent book, the state declared all the lands on which the Bedouins sit as belonging to the state. That is, they declared the Bedouins to be trespassers on their own land, okay? Because legally they didn't register it. It's very similar to India and Africa and places like this, and creates a big conflict And they said to them, you can be legal if you want, but just move to the cities that we planned for you. So there is an issue there. Then in the 1990s, massive Russian immigration. When the Cold War ended, about 1 million Russian speakers came to Israel. And a lot of them came to Beersheba. So the second largest group in Beersheba are Russians. And in 2015 we had 225,000. 53% of them Mizrahim, that is Jews from Arab countries, and 29% of them Russians. This is the two groups. By the way, they're both marginal groups. The dominant group in Israel are European Jews, but in the south, there are not that many. In the metro region, according to the metro plan, there's 620,000 people. Mizrahim are 33%, Arab are 29%, and the Russians dropped down to 27%. They're also in some towns around there. These are the three great groups in the region. You're quite likely to go on the street and hear Arabic, Russian, Hebrew, English. Mainly Arabic and Russian and Hebrew are the languages. Then recently also land is being privatized. The last 10 years land across Israel with a neoliberal policy has been privatized, and that has very different effects of different people. People like me, that I bought a house in time, privatization works for me. It makes my asset and my children much better off. But this is only the top third of the population. The bottom 2/3 suffering of privatization because the prices went up so much that it makes greater distance between them and the housing market. And of course the Arabs even hurt more by privatization because they don't even have land to be privatized because the state claims that Arab land belongs to the state. So you see how already one planning policy, which is to privatize housing, has affected differently different groups. Then we talked about gerrymandering is how the Beersheba boundaries are being drawn.
What does it mean?
Gerrymandering is a very political geography terms. Do you know what that means? Gerrymandering?
I think no one.
Yeah, it's a little bit geography talk here. And let's see how they... it's manipulating the boundaries. Oh, I lost the internet. It's manipulating the boundaries to suit the powerful.
Manipulating the boundaries.
Yeah. It starts from a person, a governor in the United States, in some states it's called Jerry something. And he managed to win the election 2 or 3 times, even though he had only 40% of the vote. 60% voted against him. But he drew the boundaries, so 40% of the vote get him majority in parliament. So this is why it's called after him in the 19th century. Mind you, what happened in Britain in the election this 2017? Theresa May only got 36% of the vote, and she has majority in the House of Commons, right? So Britain is a great example of gerrymandering in political geography. I don't know how it is in Italy. It's probably a bit more fair, because Britain is the least fair. Donald Trump was voted in on gerrymandering. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than him. 3 million more votes, but because the different power of different states, I don't exactly know how it works in the United States, he won the election almost by a landslide. He won it big, even though he got less votes. So this is what gerrymandering. Here it refers to the fact that Beersheba draws its boundaries all the time, so no Arabs will be in Beersheba, even though they could live 5 kilometers from the city center and use the city all the time, but the state would say, you will get your own local government. No, we're part of Beersheba. No, you'll get your own local government, and then of course it keeps Beersheba Jewish, which is one of the big part of the project of the Zionist state, is to keep as much as possible Jewish. And this is really quite contested. The history of planning of Beersheba is really quite important in the modern era. In the 1951, Israel did a national plan of all the cities, and this was the Arab city here, and it built, Barbara, this is where the university is here, it built new town, like, it's almost like a garden city approach. Very much neglected the Arab city, let it decline, and build the Jewish city to the north. And until now, this is the situation. This is from the first plan for Beersheba. Very suburban, almost self-contained. The only thing is that because we're in the desert, the green on the paper is yellow on the land, and it's not very attractive. And very quickly after that, they started to build in all these spaces to make it more attractive. This is how modern Beersheba was constructed. We have some very good archive in the university, and we can see how. And the Arab part, Ottoman Arab part of the city, is very neglected. It's like a slum because all the planning was oriented towards the Jewish suburbs. And now we come to, well, a few more images. So some of the areas in the inner city are well developed, and it's quite high living standards. Whether it's dense or whether it's suburban, in the suburbs too, is really quite of high quality, middle class, not more than that. And of course, you also have your lower class and Bedouin illegal shanty towns. So that city commissioned group to make an outline plan. Again, sorry, this is in Hebrew. This is the city. Around it is the metropolitan area, and this is a plan called Beersheba 2030. And the idea here, with a new wave of planning theory in Israel and I think around the world, new urbanism. So the brief was to make the city more dense, more compact. The government has issued, it's almost like a decree, an agreement, that the city, until the year 2030, will build 20,000 new dwelling units inside the existing boundaries. So this is condensing the city. It's a huge amount for a city of 220,000 people. This means adding about 60 to 70,000 new people in the city, say 30% of the city in what is now, 12, 13 years, but that was 2 years ago. So in 15 years, you add 30% of the population. And also inside the city, all the plan was urbanism. Urbanism will make the city more urban, more urban. Jane Jacob is on the front and Jane Jacob is on the back, and all the time they talk about this. But there is no consideration at all about the social impact of it. Without going into great details, this is another very nice map that they did, how you see all the arrows, all the development will come into the core of the city, which I don't think it's really such a bad idea, but it's much more too powerful and too destructive in these communities, whereas the suburbs around here are spared a lot of the development, and around the city, the Bedouins are not part of it at all. And this is the last slide here, that you see, this is Beersheba, and all these areas here, where about 110,000 Bedouins live, are not on the plans and on the map at all. They're invisible, because they consider them illegal, and they want them to move into the towns that Israel has developed. So we have two layers here. We have a plan that is for the city center, and we have ignoring and neglecting the peripheries, which are Arab. All part of it is in our social impact assessment. So then we started to work. And what we did first, we tried to translate, and it's quite simplistic, but we try to translate the social justice or urban justice literature into things that we can measure and assess. And we did two incredibly interesting workshops, including with Nurit Al-Fassi and some other professors around Israel. What should we measure? We came up with 4 things that's not far from Susan Feinstein at the end. Socioeconomic equality, people in place or in places. How are the people distributed in the city and why? The different neighborhoods, if you like. This is the relation between the different neighborhoods. Status of built environment, very important. How is the city being kept? The pavement, the housing, the open spaces. We map them first, right? The group identities and their needs. Who are they and what do they need from the city? And urban democracy. So we said we'll measure this, and here we have the methodology doing SIA. The methodology was, first we create a baseline, right, on these 4 dimensions. We do what geographers do and architects. We map the situation and what has happened in the last 20 years. And then we focus, what will be the impact of the plan on these 4 dimensions? On the socio-economic relation between the different neighborhoods, where do the rich live, where do the poor live? On the built environment, on the pavement, on the housing, on the public space, the planning institutions, what will be the impact of the plan on that? On the identities of the group, what does it give the groups? Does it give them belonging, landscape, voice in the city? Does it shape the symbolism of the city that relates to the different groups, or does it ignore them altogether? And democracy, as you know, whether they consider them, they participate in them, what are the rights of people under democracy, what are the rights of women under democracy. So we really studied that hard, and because this is more technical and more case study, I won't go into that in great detail, but here you have different measurements about gaps between, so this is housing ownership, huge differences between very low, high ownership and high. This is mobility of the people, car ownership. Again, that is a very rich neighborhood. Those are rich neighborhoods, 3 times as much car ownership. So it's mapping all the different populations and the gaps between the neighborhoods. And then the built environment, open spaces, public facilities. This is a second element. A lot of field surveys, GIS. We did layers and layers of GIS and found out the condition of public open space, for example. Yellow is very good, red is very bad. So the inner area is quite bad. As you go out, areas, the public facilities also. Look out there how hard the students work to map all the public facilities and match them to the population densities. This is public transport, accessibility, very good, very bad again. Overall, we did an upkeep index. Which neighborhoods are upkept well by the council and which are very bad. When you look around to the Bedouin areas, of course, all of them are very bad, but in the Jewish areas there is variations. From the yellow very good to the red very bad. Now all of this in Hebrew. Also we did budget analysis, diversity. We first of all mapped the different groups in the city according to the last census. Where is your father from and where is your grandfather from? Which was quite different to what we thought. And this is the stats that I read to you before. And we identify 11 main groups. The Russians and the Mizrahi and the Arabs, of course, come up as the main. Okay. And I'll just talk about this. We ask people what their needs are in the city and how they are met, and then we matched it with the plan. And we found that there's definitely a light side of planning. The Russians and the religious groups in Beersheba benefit greatly from the planning. All the facilities, libraries, community houses, housing, schools, the city gives them a lot. So while you talk about the dark side,